do know is the Word of God is true. And another thing that we know is lived human experience. So on that note, can we please all welcome Terry to the stage and he will take us through. Thank you. Shake your hand. All right, thanks for joining us, Terry. And now Terry, he's a little bit older than me, so I think he's got a fair bit of wisdom that he can share. So I'm not going to be sharing the wisdom tonight. I'm going to be asking the questions, and hopefully we can glean some of his life experience and his understanding. So, first question. I'm just going to hit you with a bunch. Is that okay?
Absolutely, go for it.
All right. So number one, why the Knights? Surely another team that wins a little.
The Knights, being a Novocastrian from the Newcastle Hunter Valley region, they had to be my team.
So growing up in Newcastle, hey?
Yep.
So growing up in Newcastle, can you describe just a little bit about your upbringing, your family life? Let's start from sort of...
Yeah, so I would say I had a normal kind of upbringing in the sense that I had my mum and my dad were both hard-working individuals. My parents, they didn't drink, they didn't do drugs, but we grew up in an environment with a lot of violence and drugs. It was a housing commission area, and anyone from the Newcastle region, and as my wife's even discovering now, whenever my wife meets someone from Newcastle and she says, "Oh, my husband's from Newcastle," and they say, "Where?" and we'll say, "Oh, Toronto," and they'll be like, "Oh, Toronto." And nothing came good out of Toronto, to paraphrase in a sense the Bible. From an early age, my dad taught me a lot of defence, fighting. I was a smaller kid, and just because of the area we were in, my dad was a very hard and tough man. He was abandoned on the steps of a church, a Catholic church, and his brother Terry, who I was named after. And so my dad had that kind of upbringing as well. And so, outside of that, my parents really worked hard and tried to do the right thing with the knowledge they had as parents.
Yeah, so as you were growing up, now obviously we're going to, the main point of tonight is to understand your journey with mental health. As you were growing up, was that something that you were aware of? Was mental health even in the conversation of, at school, at home? Was it something you were even aware of?
No, not growing up. I went to the second worst school in the state at the time, Toronto High. Violence and drugs was just a common part of the environment we lived in. I've got two uncles that were part of the nomads and the rebels, the bikies. My sister, my dad kicked my sister out of home when she was 15, living that kind of lifestyle. And even at such an early age, I aspired to be a bit more like my Uncle David and Uncle Leonard, and I wanted to be a bikie. So, at the age of 11, I started smoking pot, dealing drugs at the age of 12. Going to school in high school, tripping, taking mushies, and selling pot, selling speed, and I just thought that was okay and acceptable. My dad would come down hard on me, and so hence, at the age of 17, I guess near the end of year 10, I identified that if I wanted to do something with my life, and there was something in me that wanted to do something, and so I escaped Toronto, joined the Navy, joined the military, and set off on a new course and chapter in my life at 17.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt you. I'm really sorry. I forgot to say this at the beginning. See the big screen behind us here. There's a phone number on the screen there. Actually, part of tonight, this is my bad. Part of tonight is we're going to be having a chat with Terry. And then in the second half, he's open to answer any questions that you may have for him. So there's a phone number up there, basically, that will be sent to someone. They'll pass the messages on through to me, and you can ask any question you want. So if anything throughout the night you want to ask Terry his opinion on something, or maybe him to dive deeper into a part of his life or part of his experience, please message it through to that number, and then we'll have an opportunity at the end of the evening to answer some of those. So, you said you joined the Navy when you were 17, and you had already quite an extensive life of illicit drugs before that. Did you see any cracks in your mental well-being before that? Was that something that you were able to identify yourself?
No.
No.
Yeah, I loved that lifestyle. You know, I thought that was just common, normal. And so at that point, I enjoyed violence. I enjoyed fighting. I enjoyed that. It gave me a rush in a sense. I saw no cracks at that point in my life.
Yeah, so you were, obviously, I've known you from before tonight, I'm not just meeting you now, but you were telling me earlier that it was around 24 years old you had a bit of a moment where everything was exposed. Could you take us through the journey of joining the Navy when you're 17 till up to the age of about 24, when this mental health struggle and eventually a diagnosis came about?
Yep. So, joined the Navy. Never expected in the Navy. I joined the Navy, and many people have heard me say this before, to travel the world, get a trade, meet chicks. It's in the recruitment, you get to travel the world, and so a Navy was a great choice, I thought. But in 1991, I was on HMAS Brisbane. I was selected to go to the Gulf War in 91. So I spent 6 months there in the Gulf War, prepared. We were in the actual Persian Gulf for that period of the Desert Storm 1. Returned from there. Again, life was still good for me. I had a partner, Danielle, at the time. We had our first child. I was given a choice. I was still dealing drugs because of my connections with my uncles and other people I met in the Navy. I was dealing a lot of drugs still at that point. All through the Navy, I loved to fight. It was just a lifestyle. Again, I thought this was all fairly normal behaviour. And, for those that might know Pastor Corey Bourne, him and I were in the Navy together, and he would attest to the fact that, I was quite psychotic at times. We'd be out. I wasn't a big drinker. I didn't like to drink where I was out of control, because I always needed to be in control just in case I found myself in an argument. And, there were times where Corey and other guys, they'd wind me up just to watch me thrash and
Like a spin-up toy.
beat
Wind 'em
people
up
up.
and let you go.
Absolutely. And then we had, I got a choice when I was in the Navy to stay, and I was facing drug charges. And so I was under investigation, a federal investigation. So I chose to leave the Navy rather than be dishonourably discharged. Went to civilian life. Got myself a job as a manager for Sims Metal. Life was going well. I was as a manager for Sims Metal there in Sydney, buying, selling non-ferrous metals. Working a normal job Monday to Friday. It was high paying. It's a multi-million dollar business. I was still selling drugs. I wasn't a small-time dealer. I dealt in pounds and ounces and kilos of pot and amphetamines, occasionally ecstasy and various other things. And life was good. I had a house, car, had all the goods. But what typically would happen is Friday through to Sunday, I would go absent. I was an absent father. Monday through to Friday, I was always home with Danielle and the kids, and because I had work, I had a job, I had responsibilities. But come the weekends, I'd be off up to Newcastle, where I'd pick up my gear and bring it back and various things. Going on binges and various other things. And then what happened when I was about 24 years old is Danielle at the time had gone out one particular night. I was home looking after the two kids. She didn't come home at a certain time. I went around to her cousin's house where they were partying and drinking, and I lost the plot. I kicked their front door in, bashed her cousin, bashed her ex-boyfriend, bashed this other guy. All four of us ended up in St. Vincent's Hospital. I'd severed all the tendons in my left hand just from the pounding. I broke all the knuckles. I got plates and screws in my right hand from that particular night. And after that incident, and my Danielle at the time said, Terry, if you don't get any help, I'm leaving you. You have a problem. You're out of control. When I lost my temper, it was like a switch, and it was like kill or be killed.
So you had that, obviously, that incident. Upon reflection, could you see things bubbling up to the surface until that time? Or was that something that you would say was just out of the blue? I mean, I understand you had a fighting background and issues with your temper, like you said.
No, leading up to that moment, it was, whenever I'd go out, I was always happy-go-lucky and just lived life. But if I was pushed or shoved, or I would just lose the plot and just become so violent to the point where it was just uncontrollable.
So can you take us from that point to eventually, did you get a formal diagnosis and maybe your journey with the actual sort of, the medical side of mental health for you?
So from that point on, I went and received some treatment. First of all, went and saw a doctor. A couple of ex-Navy mates intervened, and Danielle called upon a few of my ex-Navy friends. So eventually I was sent to St. John of God, North Richmond. I did a 21-day drug rehab program there. Also at that point I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic combat disorder. I was diagnosed with manic depression, which is now known as bipolar at that point, as well as depression. And so for the next 4 to 5 years, I probably spent close to 3.5 years in the St. John of God North Richmond facility at various times for treatment, because I'd come back home and, I'd be good for a while. But eventually the violence would, come back into my life. And in that time, I didn't understand too much. I was heavily sedated, medicated, and, it was a dark journey and period in my life to the point where after about the fourth year of that, I'd gone on a bit of a bender and came home. And my partner Danielle had left to my two girls out of fear, because previously the week before I'd tied her up to a chair, put a knife to her throat. I was going to cut her throat, kill her. I was so psychotic. Following that incident, I was arrested by the police a week later. I had my two daughters in my car. 5 police cars came, pulled me over, surrounded me, ripped me out of the car, and at that point I was taken to James Fletcher.
All right, Terry. You just take your time, Terry. You're all good.
Which is another mental facility in Newcastle, and I was locked up under the State Mental Act. I was deemed too dangerous for myself and society. So in that place, again, I saw many counsellors, many psychiatrists, many psychologists, medication up and down, and again, I still had no understanding of why I was the way I was. And again, please understand this is my journey, what I've learned and what I've discovered in years of study after salvation. And what I felt was that they didn't offer me any answers to why I was the way I was. They just offered me more medication, more treatment, and just try this pill, that pill. And, I acknowledge and admit, I was smoking pot and taking drugs in my early years and informative years and various things. And I would challenge and question the doctors. I'm like, hang on, you're telling me this is bad, but yet you're giving me all these different medications, antipsychotic drugs, Valiums, depressants, all these pills and medications and all these counselling sessions. I went to my first AA meeting, and I didn't grow up in a religious home. My dad hated God because of what abuses he experienced at the hands of the Catholic Church. And I remember the first AA meeting I went to in the early stages of my first hospitalizations. And, that's when I learned the Serenity Prayer. But in that, it was not put your trust in God or in God we trust. It was explained to me, this higher power, it could be God, it could be God backwards. You've just got to, and, this just went on for so long in my life that every time I would come back, I just would be the same or worse. And on reflection, I think back to my first hospitalization. Yes, I was violent. Yes, I experienced voices and various other things. And at this point, I'd now been diagnosed with schizophrenia, dual psychosis, polysubstance abuse. I had all these titles given to me, and every time I'd ask the doctors, can I get better? Will I get well? It was, no, Terry, you got to learn to manage this. This is who you are now. Going to AA and NA meetings, it's like, hi, my name's Terry. I'm an alcoholic. I'm a drug addict. Just speaking. And, Pastor Ash mentioned this morning in his sermon the power of words. For those 5 to 6 years of my mental health battle and struggles, the only thing that was ever spoken over my life were words that weren't words of hope or encouragement. They were just words that, that never gave me any answers. When I asked for the answers, when I was locked up in James Fletcher, and, at times I would refuse my medication. It was quite a violent ward there. No nurses were on the station. At night we would be locked in, and they'd come and check every hour on us. The only time we'd have contact with people is when violence would break out. The nurses would run in, the sirens would go off, and bang, they'd just hit us with a narcotic and knock us out. And so at the end of that journey in James Fletcher, I was hearing lots of voices. I'd become so violent that if the voices in my head would tell me to hurt and harm people, I would. I turned to doing home invasions, armed robs, collecting debts. I just wanted to die. That's all I wanted.
So you were in and out of hospital, and it's obvious, like you're saying there, that you were attempting to self-medicate as well when you were out, some sort of any coping strategy, because your experience, what you're telling me, is that there was really not a lot of hope. Is that what you had was a problem with no answer. But I'm talking to you tonight, and you're a different man. So what was the turning point? What actually triggered the change that has flipped your life upside down, and obviously for the better?
Yep. What the triggering point was eventually I succumbed to the voices of killing myself. I never wanted to kill myself. I didn't want my two girls, Tian and Tanner, growing up knowing this is how messed up in my mind I was. I didn't want my two girls to grow up knowing their dad killed himself. But everything inside me, I wanted to die. That's why I was doing armed robs. That's why I was doing debt collection, home invasions. I remember once the police came to my door and to issue me with a warrant of arrest, and I'm sitting in my lounge room. I have my shotgun, and I've just pointed it at the doorway, and I'm in essence was just hoping they'd come in and just open fire on me. I just wanted it to all end, the pain, the darkness, the voices, everything to stop. And eventually I was on probation and parole. I was facing 4 to 8 years jail and had to report twice daily to the police station. And this particular day, I gave into the voices. I jumped in my car, went out the bush, and had an 8-ball of amphetamines. I filled up 14 syringes with drugs. I was sitting out there and I was smoking some dope, drinking a bourbon. Bourbon was my drink of choice, and again, I didn't like to get too drunk. And I remember distinctly sitting there in my car, and before I started pumping the drugs into my veins, because again, previous to all this, I acknowledge and admit I was a drug dealer, but I also, during all this time, became a drug addict, an intravenous user. And so here I am, I'm sitting there in my car, and for the first time in my life, and even when we went to the Gulf War, they gave us Bibles, and the first time I ever read a Bible was in year 7, when they gave us a Bible in year 7. I went down the bush, ripped out a page, rolled a joint and smoked it. And so, I had that was my understanding. But here I am, out in the middle of the bush. I just reported in the morning to the police station, and I'm now crying out to God. I'm drinking the bourbon, I'm smoking pot. I've got 14 syringes on the dash of my car, and I remember crying out to God, God, if you're real, why is my life like this? If you're so and I'm cursing, and I'm just going off before I eventually just pumped 7 syringes into one arm, 7 into the other arm, blew my veins out. And obviously I came to, I'd missed my appointment, my parole that night, reporting to the police station. The next morning I woke, felt like I'd died and a truck had hit me. I went to the police station, handed myself in, had to go get treatment on my arms. Lost license, they took my car, they took everything at that point. And then for the following 2 weeks, I had to walk past to get to the police station after getting treatment at the hospital and coming out. I had to walk past a number of churches, and I had lots of voices, but what's interesting about voices is they were my own voices, my own voice, but in my head. And I'd walk past these churches, and a new voice would appear, my own voice, and it would be like, the answers you seek are in there. But then I had this other voice. It was like the cartoons of the angel and the devil on my shoulders, and then this voice would be like, they don't care about you. Look at you, you're a junkie. You're abandoning your kids. You just, I've beaten people, I've stabbed people, I've shot people, I've done horrendous things. You don't deserve any. You just deserve to die. And what happened is, I'm walking. This 2 weeks after my suicide attempt, I'm walking to the police station one morning. I had a bag of pot in one pocket, a bag of go in another pocket, and Corey Bourne, Pastor Corey Bourne, if you don't know who he is, he's a pastor in our fellowship. He got saved while I was in the Navy. Tried to witness to me, tried to tell me about Jesus. And he was a guy that used to love to watch me thrash people. I would sell him and his brothers drugs. And he just happened to pull up. He recognised me, and at this point I weighed about 80 kilos, had a shaved head, had a goatee down to here. I was a good-looking chappie, don't you worry.
That's a sight. I'd like to see a photo of that.
You should see me when I first went to church. And he happened to pull up. And he's like, Tezza, what are you doing? And he knew Danielle, he knew my children. And at that point, pride inside of me wanted to tell him, life was good. But then I heard another voice, and that voice said to me, Terry, you need to make a choice. I'm thinking, what the hell is, Anyway, Corey says to me, he goes, oh man, do you want to hang out, rah, rah, and I'm in Newcastle today seeing customers. And I said, oh, well, man, I said, I've got to go to the police station and report, So I spent the whole day with Corey, and he was telling me about his life. I knew his wife, I knew his children, I knew his family, and he knew mine. And by that afternoon, and even in the afternoon, he said to me, Terry, you need Jesus. He's the only one that can help you. I'm like, Bornie, we've been down this road. But there was that voice again that said, Terry, you need to make a choice. And I thought to myself, and I said to Bonnie, you know what? I said, rehab didn't help me. The hospital had never helped me out. And no one's, I said, you know what? Why don't I just give this Jesus thing a go? And even at that point, he pulls over, and I may have shared this, and some people may have heard this previously. And, you know, we pull over to a place where, you know, it's the kind of place I you know, and Corey, before salvation, would take people, beat them, dump them in a place called Sandgate. And we pull over, and he's like, Terry, you know what? You need to, I'm going to pray, lead you in a prayer. And, you know, he's like, hold my hand. I'm looking at Bonnie, and, you know, if you know Corey, he's big, he's massive. And then this other voice in my head is like, Terry, he's been sent here to do you over. And so now I'm thinking, hang on, this is serious. So I look around, I reach around the car, and I grab a screwdriver on his floor. And then he's like, Terry, okay, I'm going to, you know, I'm holding his hand at this point. He says, now close your eyes. And right now, at that point, the voice is like, Terry, just stab him in the throat. But this other voice is, no, it's going to be all right, it's going to be all right, it's going to be all right. And I'm thinking, what? I'm torn between stabbing him in the throat, but eventually I just close my eyes, and he leads me in a prayer. And I tell you, that prayer changed my life. In an instant of time, I opened my eyes. For the first time in 6 years, I saw colour. My world prior to that was black and dark. And Corey, with all his enthusiasm, he says, how do you feel? And I'm sitting there, and I'm like, I said, Bonnie, and it might seem strange to you, but for someone that was in darkness, this swamp area that we're in had all these little yellow flowers, just weeds. And I said to him, I said, Bonnie, were all those flowers here? He's like, yeah. I get out of the car, and I'm like, God is real. God is real. And that's all I could say. He took me home that day to my parents' house. My parents, when we first pull up, Corey at that point had a paddy wagon. It looked like a police paddy wagon. My parents come out. They knew
First time in one of those?
Yeah, it wasn't the first time. And my parents knew Corey quite well. And they're like, Corey, because they hadn't seen Corey in years. And I'm like, God is real. God is real. And that's all I could do. The drugs in my pocket, I flushed down the toilet that night. And all night I stood in the backyard, and I looked up at the stars in the heavens, and I was just like, God is real. God is real. God is, and I just couldn't fathom how real God was.
Did you hear any more of the voices after that? Like, what was so you said you saw colour, which obviously is probably this incredible life-changing experience, but you've said you've had years and years of, battling with different types of mental illness. Yep. Leading up to that moment in time. What was it like after that? Was it an instant remedy, or was there issues afterwards?
There were many issues afterwards, especially for, I guess, the first 12 months, because I didn't know how to be a Christian. I didn't know how to be a man of God, and I was still on probation and parole. I still had the 4 to 8 years jail hanging over my head. I still had a court case pending. I still had to report to the police station, and so quite quickly the voices never subsided. For the first few days and even weeks and months, it was a real struggle and battle in my head to try and discern or understand what was really going on. I was healed of drug addiction. I never touched drugs again from that night. Just the crave, all that was gone. And, there's been times a year or two later I did backslide and indulge a little bit due to other external circumstances and my own fault. Because one of the things I learned on my journey of mental health and salvation was quite quickly I needed to, one, remove myself from the environment. I quickly went to the courts, got myself bail and paroled into Parramatta. And many people know my early years of salvation. I had to sort out a lot of stuff, especially with my two daughters, my own mental health. And for the first few months, all I did was read the Bible. I hated people. I hated Christians. I hated going to church. I'd go to church those first few weeks going to church. People would be like, "Hey, Terry," a bunch of happy clappers, and they got their life in order. And I'd be like, "Listen, just F off before I rip your head off. Don't talk to me." I didn't want anything to, but they had something I desired and needed and wanted. I didn't know what that was. But I just knew I had to be there. I needed to know Jesus. I needed to know God. And so for months, the first few months, I was living at Corey and Sharon's house, and I just would spend hours just trying to read the Bible. I didn't understand it. I couldn't make sense of it. My head was scattered, but I just kept reading and beginning to understand the promises of God. And all this time I'm still reporting to the psychiatrist, my psychologists, and challenging them and asking them, even in those first few months, I had a couple of violent episodes, and a guy ripped Corey's family off and me off, and I hunted him down and hog-tied him up, gave him a beating, and Pastor Corey convinced me that that's not what Christians do, Terry. That's not what we do. We take them to the police. So we took him to the police. I was like, oh, okay, well, that's not what Christians do. Okay, I won't do that again. I was playing OzTag, and some people may have heard many of the stories. A couple of times I dropped people either with headbutts or various things, and then on one game it was like a riot and police, and it was just a scene, and just me going psychotic, wanting to fight 200 Muslims, and boys, we can take them all, the pastors, and then I'm turning on them, you bunch of cowards, rah rah rah, and we can do this, and so there were many problems and doubts with the relationship with my children. I had to, and even to this day, I still have doubts and self-talk, and and again, I reflect on my mental health journey, and mental health matters. And I'm not a great advocate for some of today's modern mental health and the way things are done and different diagnoses, but that's for a different time perhaps, or people can ask me. But the genuine power and help comes through Christ and His Word. The words that were spoken over to me in those years of darkness were words of no hope, no future, but Jesus gives us a hope and a future. Even to this day, there are times where, the Bible teaches us, Jesus teaches us, where we need to take every thought captive that exalts itself against the knowledge of Christ. And how do we gain that knowledge? But by being in Christ, being in church, being in His Word, and through prayer and relationship. And, I still, there are days where I think, Terry, you're an idiot. And I say these things to me, and you're hopeless and you're no good. But I have to take that captive quick. When the thoughts of, and I still have thoughts of harming people. My wife will tell you, sometimes when I get a bit road ragey, I will seriously, like when that guy jumped my fence and brought fear to my daughter and stole the bike. I tell you, if I'd got him in my backyard, I probably, we all would have been laying hands on him for healing. It's in me. It's who I was. But the Bible says I'm now a new creation. When I introduce myself, it's no longer hello, my name's Terry, I'm an addict. It's hello, my name's Terry, I'm a child of God.
Yeah, that's good, Terry.
I'm like, and that's what I've discovered, and blessed be to the Lord. For months I couldn't work a job, and again I reflect back on my journey, and I was working a job, and then I went and got treatment, and I lost everything. Now, that a lot of that is to my own detriment, and but again, all the hospitals and doctors and rehab, none of them taught me to take responsibility for my choices, my decisions. What it did was it gave me excuses. When I'd beat people and do home invasions, I'd be in there collecting money for the nomads and the rebs, and I'd be like, listen, you know what? I could cut your throat and wouldn't spend a day in jail. I'm a psycho. I'm a registered psycho. I'll just go to the mental hospital for a period of time and I'll be free. You look at our court systems. It's all based on excuses. No one today has taken responsibility for who they are. And yes, there's trauma in people's lives, and I'm not dismissing any of that, and every health battle's different. But what Jesus taught me was, Terry, you need to take responsibility, and I will help you. I'll give you my Holy Spirit. I'll give you a way of escape. And, for months I used to witness to Paula, and she'd argue with me, and God changed my heart, and, 20-odd years married, and I never thought I'd be married. I was not worthy to be loved again. I never thought I'd have a relationship with my other two daughters. Yes, I do. At first supervised visits, and my wife and I, Paula, would have them on weekends. The miracles, God gave me an incredible job. After a year of salvation, I started there as a labourer. Within a year and a half, 2 years, I was the manager of the place, and eventually after many years, earned 200K plus. I didn't deserve any of this because of who I was, but in Christ, I deserve it all.
Last question. It's incredible. Based on all your experience, all the life that you've lived, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who may be on a similar journey, or someone who is battling with a mental illness or having concerns about their mental health, what's one piece of advice that you would give them?
My one piece of advice would be turn to the Word of God. Turn to Jesus. The Bible teaches us to guard your mind and your heart and to love God with all your mind, heart and soul. And I truly do believe that is the answer, and that would be my advice. Turn to Jesus. Seek His help. Seek His guidance. Seek answers in and through Him, and begin a relationship with Him. And I think, I do believe the reason I am the man I am today is because of that foundation in my life. And I'm far from perfect. I don't have all the answers. I'm still a mess at times. But I turn to His Word. I turn to His prayer. And at times, I turn to my pastor for advice. Many times. Or other godly men. And that would be my word.
Sounds like
the world's
sound
wisdom
advice.
is frivolity.
Yeah. Do you mind if I speak to the audience for a minute?
Yeah.
Is that all right? Tonight, Terry talked about having a choice. You have a choice tonight too. Is that we all, like Terry's spoken about a couple of times, is we all have a different journey, we all have a different walk. But what Jesus has done to Terry's life, like we said, that's the one thing, the lived human experience that is known, that can change your life too. So I just want to ask you to do one thing for me tonight. This will only be a short part of the service. But can I ask you to bow your heads, please? This is just